A little opening intro out of the way. Welcome to Evolution Hour, Fixity class, etc., etc. dantortuganwordpress.com, which contains so much wonderful stuff for freebie. That is kind of the precursor of the material that we're working at. As you can obviously see, I am not in my den. I'm here in Seattle with my niece and then their Montessori school, which I peer up every once in a while. There will be links in the show, but I won't be able to stick them in until I get back to Spokane to go on my little PC to put up the links. So that'll probably be early December, maybe around the time that I'm doing the couple shows down the line, but we'll see what's going on, as we can tell. Of course, we are continuing the exciting world of Titans, the creationist dinosaur book, and plowing through their little source material. This one came up as kind of a funky little surprise that ultimately connected up perfectly with the thing that I wanted to have as the part two part of the show. And Sanford and Tay are continuing the parade of in-house apologetics, pretty much. And one of which was a 2018 piece by Tay that is just more apologetic recycling. They're still churning around about the issues of speciation and whether or not speciation can be fitted in smoothly into the creationist model and whether or not it's a problem at all for evolutionary models, which they're not really going into much material on. Anyway, that Tay 2018 piece and another one from Dominic Statham 2010, the book actually listed it as 2009, which is probably when an early version of it came out, but it eventually appeared in their technical journal, and that's the version that I'm going to be linking to. And it was being cited by Sanford and Tay on whether the old Earth founder Charles Lyell's, quote, flood-denying dogma, unquote, played a part in the evolutionary thinking being philosophical and dogmatic rather than based on actual physical evidence. It's an interesting little long piece, which again operates as an awful lot of kind of authority quoting. And it was in whipping down through a lot of that I started to make sense about what was going on in terms of the argument. Statham's bit was a deck stacker. And it argued that Darwin and Lyell weren't actually basing their arguments on evidence, but on a philosophical position. And I bristled at the start when Statham had the cheek to authority quote John Lennox and later on Stephen J. Gould, both of them decidedly not young Earth creationist apologetics. Lennox is kind of a pro-intelligent design guy, but definitely not in favor of the YEC cosmology. So, yeah, a little bit of a snark on that part. Sedgwick, who was a great influence on the geology that Darwin understood. Hello, Brian. Is mentioned just very briefly regarding an 1834 snark at Lyell. And that involved a background context that you'd have to read up on to really find out what the hell was going on, because it was the issue in the early stages of Lyell's argument, whether a kind of hyper-uniformitarianism was the dominant mode. And Lyell, for example, thought that all volcanic operations, all volcanic operations basically took place at a steady rate. And we would now know in our present times that big magma plumes, Yellowstone volcanoes, things like that can operate at a different pacing that you would a smaller scale thing like what goes on in Hawaii and Iceland. So having Sedgwick snarking over Lyell in the early stages of this argument in no way undermined what Darwin was doing around that period or what the science of geology and evolutionary thinking over the 1840s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s was doing. It also belied the background context of what was going on. It's Tay's piece is arguing anti-Christians were all over the place. They were deists, they were denying of God, Unitarians, liberal Whigs, and all of that, kind of into revolutions and the sort. Without diving into any detail about what the social conservatism was, what the Tory positions were, how this connected up with slavery favoring, and how this connected up with colonialism and opposition to labor unions ultimately, and all sorts of things. Lyell, by the way, was a politically conservative person who was not at all unfavorable to the Southern aristocrats during the Civil War. And so all of that connects up in a much broader context that Tay's cartoon version conveniently leaves out. But a surprise came up quite unexpectedly in relation to one of the sources that Statham drew on, which was a very innocuous piece about the supposed political liberalism and attitudes of the Whig pro-modern uniformitarian geology set. It was from George Grinnell from 1976 from Kronos magazine. And I was looking at that and trying to think, well, was I going to be able to get this old work online at some point? And then suddenly I went all oogly boogly because I suddenly remembered what Kronos magazine was. This is not a technical journal in any way, shape, or form. This happened to be a Velikovskyan journal from the 1970s. And the reason why I knew about it is because I had my little Velikovsky phase back in that period. And I actually knew the people who were doing the magazine and their attempts to have this thing field. And they kept it up for quite a few years before it kind of fizzled out. So I just went down to my library down in my basement and pulled out that particular issue of Kronos. And yep, that was it. That's who Grinnell was. My mouth dropped open at this point. There was no indication. I don't even know whether or not Tay was aware of its Velikovskyan connotations, but the more important point would be, how did he know about it? And I did find that a version of it was printed at a particular website that I'll be putting a link to so you too can read the original article. It's a relatively short little piece, doesn't have any references in it, so it's very generic and vague to make the kind of point that he was trying to deal with it. But it does suggest either that Tay was familiar with the Velikovsky catastrophism stuff that was taking place during that period, and or glommed onto it from the website material, if it was available at the time he was doing his thing, which it probably was. Now, when I did a little searching on this thing, I found out that it had been cited one other time, very peripherally, by Ted Mortensen, his apologetics. And it happened to be, Statham has drawn very extensively on Mortensen's stuff. And so if you look at a 1997 piece that was at Answers in Genesis, had this citation of Grinnell, and you'll be able to spot how similar so much of the argument is to what's being presented in Tay's bit. Now, this then led to the jump into the whole notion about the idea that evolution is not based on empirical evidence, and it's not based on the ability to produce results or anything. It's just the philosophy. Let me jump over and put up our patrons to give them a big shout out, since I didn't put that up initially. And as usual, old RJ is wandering around in his window clicking. And there we go, sharing our colleagues, our researchers, our assistant researchers, our friends, and our legacy patrons, without which it would be way harder to be able to pull off the research that I'm doing in pulling together all the dots being connected to make sure that all of this stuff is working properly. So what's the part two, which is the idea that evolution is very much, hi, Brian, very much a predictive enterprise and a theoretically productive one. And it happens to be that I had seen Zach Hancock in our little network on Twitter was putting up an information. He put up a brand new paper by Rougemont, which is about maladaptation in Pacific salmon. And Zach pointed out that the quote, the results align remarkably well with expectations under the nearly neutral theory of molecular evolution, unquote. And Zach commented how this confirmed, quote, that the genetic load is negatively correlated with the recombination rate as long predicted by theory, unquote. So what that new paper was reflecting is how the evolutionary science stuff that began in Darwin's era and continued on through for the last 150 years has been one that actually pays attention to data, actually is doing the research at a fundamental level, actually works out predictions and observations and attempts to test them out in great detail. And that can be contrasted with the big smoke and mirrors fluff that's going on over in young earth creationism land. And for one of them Mortensen and ultimately Statham, to play off of a 1970s Velikovskian journal as if it were a legitimate source for a little blip of information is a clue as to what kind of background apologetics trawling is going on in the creationist movement. In the same way that I pointed out I think I've alluded to it in Evolution Slam Dunk, which of course I would be pointing to over my shoulder if I were still at home in my library, in relation to this really amazingly stupid journal, the Canadian Journal of Anthropology, Lee's article, that pops up surprisingly often in creationist apologetics. And it was only by an unbelievable piece of luck that I discovered that my own university, Eastern Washington State College at the time, now Eastern Washington University over in Cheney, Washington, happened to have carried that particular little journal. So I was able to go physically out to Cheney and look in their back stacks and find, ta-da, the hard copy, because it's not available anywhere online. And that's when I discovered that this thing was never an academic journal. It was a mimeograph sheet that was put out by a bunch of wacky creationists who were also obsessed with the idea that the Vikings had come to America and settled in ways that even the Viking didn't actually do. And that they were really bristling over Columbus getting all of this credit and all of that stuff. So they had a lot of issues dangling around. And they were this article, the Lee article, relates to radiometric dating and the supposed problems with radiometric dating, which, by the way, the author had absolutely no credentials to be able to accomplish in a journal that was not actually a journal. It was just a mimeograph sheet put out by some Canadian creationists. So that kind of principle, that you would never know that when you just saw the Canadian Journal of Anthropology popping up in the citations of creationist work, just as you wouldn't obviously realize that Grinnell's piece from Kronos wasn't actually from a scholarly journal at all, but was from a lower echelon Velikovsky favoring catastrophist thing. For those of you who may not be aware of Immanuel Velikovsky and his Worlds in Collision stuff, he was a Russian, I think he was born in Russia and eventually emigrated to, the way he got around, eventually ended up in the United States. And he came up with this psychoanalytic theory that ancient mythology that referred to planetary or gods representing planets doing all sorts of catastrophes was a real thing. And he worked out this elaborate cosmology where the planet Venus was ejected from Jupiter, as Athena was ejected from the head of Zeus. And the planets were roaming around, and Mars nearly collided with the Earth, and a whole bunch of things happened. And all of this was taking place in the period 1500 BC down to later. Needless to say, it got snarked at a lot when it came out in 1950. And it also involved him defending the traditional biblical chronology, which had the Exodus taking place at 1500 BC. And so he's correlating that in as well. And this involved therefore moving an awful lot of Egyptian chronology around, because he wanted to take this Ipuwer papyrus from the Middle Kingdom, which is hundreds of years earlier, and pull it down to correlate with this supposed catastrophe that's happening with Venus. And so that connects up as well with the modern era creationists, Down and others, who are trying to defend the traditional Usher format chronology, where the Exodus takes place at 1500 BC. That also requires moving things around, because the modern chronology and archaeology would suggest that if it took place at all, the Exodus is more like about 1150, 1200 BC, down in the New Kingdom Ramessids in that period. And so every one of these attempts to kind of revise and tweak chronology, Velikovsky had tried that on a gigantic scale back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. He, right up to the time of his death, he wrote a multi-volume work where he was trying to construct an entirely new structure. And every once in a while, Velikovsky gets cited in the creationist literature. So that's another little dead giveaway, that you've got somebody drawing on baggage that has itself gigantic levels of baggage, but they're not always drawing attention to it. And it pops up particularly in that issue about trying to defend the traditional chronology. It's a feature that we're not really going to be delving into much in Volume 2 of Rocks Were There. I would be pointing to the thing at this stage, because that biblical apologetic stuff is not really the subject of the work. But it's a topic that will be delved into in more detail in a future project that Jackson and I have in the works, which is about the origin and evolution and structure of religions and all that stuff. And in that respect, the issue of how biblical apologists have wiggled and trying to restructure the chronology of things in relation to other cultures pops up quite a bit. And so it's, in fact, one of the great litmus tests that you can do. If you're dealing with particularly young Earth creationists, ask them not only when they think the flood happened, but when they think the Exodus happened. And regardless of how squishy they may be on the flood, they're probably going to hammer in at that 1500 BC, 1450 period, because that's the date that Bishop Ussher has in his chronology. Whether or not they're willing to do the 2348 BCE thing for the flood depends on how closely they're adhering to Answers in Genesis and some of these others. And we're going to have a juicy section on just how varied the dating of the flood is by biblical creationists, all using the biblical texts, dating, adding up the patriarchs and doing all the little shtick that's supposed to be so rigorous and precise that they can nail it down quite detailed, but in fact spreads across hundreds and 500 and 1,000 years, depending upon which translation you use and which ones you decide to wait, and how you date the Adam and Eve, because it's often keyed to the creation event and the Garden of Eden. And there is a remarkable range of stuff that's been going on for centuries in there. And it was only when we cataloged all of this stuff for the new book that our jaws are dropping, as we realize that you've got this unbelievable mess of lack of equanimity. But you don't get that if you just read one narrow branch of apologetics. And particularly since Answers in Genesis has gotten to be such a big kid on the block, that all too many creationists are drawing on Answers in Genesis as the authoritative conduit for young Earth creationist apologetics, in much the same way, to use a completely wacky counterexample, in much the same way that modern tarot card designers, in trying to come up with their occult tarot designs, are basically copying one version of the occult tarot, which was made up out of thin air by various groups over the period from 1800 down into the late 19th and early 20th century. And so if you were to look at occult tarots, and I happen to collect playing cards, and so I was well aware of this stuff. If you look at occult tarots in their varieties in, say, 1900 or 1910, 15, 20, 20, 30, 50, all the way along in there. There's an awful lot of different kinds of designs. They have differing numbers of the cards and the images on them. Some are Egyptian, pseudo-Egyptian, and a whole bunch of different things go on. That all changes as more and more occult tarot people start copying up one particular tarot deck that was designed, the Waite deck from 1910, that started to become more and more featured as the occult tarot. And in the occult boom in the 1960s on, really got popularized. And by the time you start hitting the 1980s, for all practical purposes, occult tarot designers are just copying the Waite deck. Which has illustrated suit cards, so you don't have to memorize what the meanings of all the cards are. And it has an idiosyncratic numbering system as to which card refers to which image, which number, because they're trying to fit it into the Kabbalah. And so they moved a couple cards around. They flipped them in order to fit the Kabbalistic theory. It's why there's an Aries the Ram symbol on the Emperor card in the Waite deck. It's because the Hebrew Kabbalah letter for that particular card number 4, I think it is, happens to be Aries the Ram, but they switched the Emperor with another card, and so they did a whole bunch of stuff. Well, the Emperor wasn't flipped, but they did decide to put Aries the Ram designs, which no tarot ever had. They flipped, let me see, what did I think they flipped? Justice and Strength, I think. I think those two were the that are, you can tell it if you look at a standard Marseille format tarot and try to align them up with the Waite deck, you discover that 2 of the cards have gotten flipped. But you would never realize that there was that tinkering going on if all you do is see the modern versions. And all of these competitors have been practically wiped out of existence because the Waite deck has become just the standard model on this. So that same process that occurs in occult thinking occurs in a lot of areas. We're going to be alluding to how not just Answers in Genesis, but the Institute for Creation Research and others have tried to play tidy up when it comes to the racism angle of creationism in the 60s. Henry Morris and others had just really levels of racist positions in their apologetics. And it was certainly part of the culture of people who grew up with that stuff. They know it firsthand. And it turned an awful lot of people in the movement off when they thought that was not very nice. Well, it's now very unfashionable to think that creationism could have had some positive views about slavery or about racism in general, and all of the Curse of Ham stuff that had played such a part in traditionalist religious apologetics, particularly among the anti-evolution branch of conservative Christianity, that had ever existed at all. That's very out of fashion. So they just remove the history and pretend as though racism only exists because nasty, godless Darwinians are out there doing all of this stuff. And you find that that's going to be a topic that we're going to go into in considerable detail in Volume 2 of Rocks Were There, point to the book that would be up to my shoulder. So that's going to be a fun part. Anyway, as I point out, we should be able to do another show next week about the same time. It'll probably be as truncated, but none of the links will be in yet until I get back to Spokane, at which point I'll be putting all of that stuff in there, and then you can run them up. And then we'll be back on the normal thing for at least a couple of weeks, and then there will be another hiatus when I'm here for Christmas, and that'll spill over into about the New Year period. So we'll wing it and see where we go on this stuff. So I've got all the material prepped. Oh, here I'll actually put up on the screen so that you can see that the Darwin Lyell and the Origin of Species stuff. That's the Journal of Creation piece, which is fairly long. It's 2, 4, 6. It's about 8 pages long. It's got 74 footnotes in it. But you'll be able to compare that with the Mortensen chapter as to see how many of the same apologetic points, and in many cases the same sources. Although, because that Grinnell piece was used so cursorily, it was just as part of a string of references that were being dropped at one point and wasn't discussed specifically. Tay really had to have looked at the original piece at some point, and either he found an online version of it that he was tracking that down, or somebody suggested to him that, or somebody knew about the Chronos Journal directly and had it in their library. It's hard to say what the circumstances are, but needless to say, there suggests a sidebar reading in the same way that you can see. There we go. Yes, hello, Heat Shield. In the same way that Bill Dembski at one point, early in his apologetics, I think it was one of the books he came out with, like 2002, 2004, somewhere around in that period, had a piece where he was explaining what the creationist position was, because Dembski is an intelligent design person, and he distances himself from overt young earth creationism. And the example that he gave for this was just a wacky book. I think it was by co-authored by Clifford Wilson, who is the nutball creationist that's associated with Karl Barth. And it's so obscure as a creationist book. I mean, he wasn't citing Henry Morris or Duane Gish or, Gary Parker. One of the big works that were coming out in the 1970s and 80s that would be the scholarly, if you will, characterization of what creationist positions were. Instead, he was presenting something that was quoted from kind of the Eric von Daniken level of young earth creationism. And that suggests a reading list on his part. That's very interesting that he would ever have encountered that book. How did he ever do that? Lovely launch, Chaz. Hope you saw it in the morning. Nice to see it. Yeah, the launch of the new rocket ship that Elon Musk, savior of the universe, got off. So it got off the ground okay. Well, bless him. Yes, hopefully he'll continue to be doing better, or his company will, in that regard, than handling Twitter/X and the like. But we're in a potentially exciting period if we can get past assails on the Republic by the Trumpistas and all of these other things that are going on, and potential flashpoints in the Middle East and the Russian-Ukraine fracas and our problems with the Chinese and all the other stuff. Because as you start getting private enterprise involved in space exploration, that brings down the cost and improves rocket technology and all the kinds of things that we can deal with to get ourselves back on track as progressing through the solar system and exploring stuff and improving people's lives on Earth instead of blowing each other up with munitions. That's what we should be doing. We have a lot of progress that still needs to be done, and a lot of people that still need to be lifted up into a world of good environment. And so long as we've got these terrible distractions, we've got that. And the reason why we have a lot of these terrible distractions is because we have people in charge of some countries who are Tortugan ideologues and nutballs. And the more countries that have Tortugan ideologues and nutballs in power, the more likelihood it is that things are going to screw up and derail all of that. How big a fan? Yes. I haven't covered the last bit as to seeing the details on that because I was on the road and now I'm setting up in here, and I kind of go into a void of bumping into the news and the Twitter feeds, and that I comment a little bit on that on my smartphone. But basically, we have relatives to enjoy and things to do and all that stuff. And so I try to push the universe of troubles away unless something really disastrous happens. But anyway, the latest bit politically is that George Santos looks like he's going to get censored and maybe expelled. And he's certainly not going to be running for re-election, although given his pathological lying and nutballery, would it surprise me if he tried to hold on to power? I don't know. So we're in a very wacky environment. The power brokers in the Republican Party, or I should say the Rhino Trumpistas, would prefer not to lose that potential seat because the governor of New York is a Democrat, and so might be appointing somebody, even if a Republican, who might not be congenial to the Freedom Caucus, Trumpista, wackaloon branch of the air quotes Republican Party today, and that's would bear on stuff. So anyway, we live in terribly interesting times, and fistfights almost breaking out in committee hearings until Bernie Sanders comes in. No, sit down. You're a senator. Don't do that. I mean, it's spectacular comedy, and at the same time, you should be going, what the hell's going on here? You kids are on our dime. You are representatives and senators that you're being paid for by our money, and how dare you act like nitwits? You have more important things to do. There's more important action to be done. Act like somebody who's earning your pay instead of acting like twaddle. So anyway, there's my little political rant for the moment. And we're about half an hour, so that can qualify as a halfway decent thing. Anyone got any questions here for me? If not, then I'll put up our advert for The Rocks Were There, and remind everybody that there's books, which I would be pointing to at home, and there's fiction material as well. It's holiday season. It's stocking stuffer time, and everybody knows how nice and thick the works are. You get your money's worth with the Paralogs books and Rocks Were There and Evolution Slam Dunk. You're not getting cheapy material. So let me schedule up my advert for the show. Come on. Here we go. Okay, and then we need to put up our window. Here we go. And there we go. And that will remind everybody about the book. I'm sure we'll be doing a secondary advert for Volume 2 when we get that out of the way. It's going to be just as juicy and up to date. For those familiar with Volume 1, if you think that we've exhausted all of the stupid of the creationist movement, au contraire, there's still so much wrong that they have, and we can show it. So anyway, everybody watch out for wooden penguins, and stay safe wherever you are, and try to avoid catastrophes and avoid being a nuisance, and make life better for people around you, and have some fun during the holidays. We'll hopefully be able to see you next week, all kids, and